Good evening, boys and girls. My name is Henrik Palmgren. Thank you for stopping by. This is Red Ice Creations Radio. Our website is redicecreations.com. Check out our brand new live webcasts. That's the latest addition to the many ways we're trying to spread interesting and important information, that is. And today we have John Irvin with us on the program. He has, together with Andrew Ruchaji, co-authored Astrotheology and Shamanism, and they are also behind the DVD The Pharmacratic Inquisition. The website is gnosticmedia.com, and John has a new book out now called The Holy Mushroom, Evidence of Mushrooms in Judeo-Christianity. And there is a website set up for that as well that you can take a look at. It's simply theholymushroom.com. And this is a critical re-evaluation of the schism between John Allegro and Gordon Wasson over the theory of entheogenic origins of Christianity, as presented in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And this is what we're going to dive into here today. So, hi John, welcome back to the program. Nice to have you again.
Hello Henrik, and thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
So why don't we begin to talk a little bit about this schism, and maybe we can even begin to talk a little bit about John Allegro for those who aren't familiar with him or his work before we move on, talk more about Gordon Wasson. John Allegro, some of his research, some of his theories, tell us a little bit about some of the work that he did.
Well, John Allegro was originally one of the original 8 members that was hired to help translate the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in Qumran in the Judean desert in 1947. And in 1953 or 54, while Allegro was studying for his doctorate degree at Oxford University, he was called as basically one of the leading experts in philology and language and biblical languages to help translate the scrolls, and he was recommended with higher honors to be the sole representative for England at the time. And so he went into Israel, or actually what was then Jordan, and began working on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there was basically an ensuing battle between John Allegro and the rest of the other Dead Sea Scrolls translators. The other members of the translation team were almost, except for maybe one or two others, they were nearly all Catholic priests. And so Allegro, he had started out originally as when he was the minister or whatever aboard his ship when he was in the army in World War II. Mm-hmm. And when he left the army, he began studying for the Methodist ministry and thought he was going to go into the church, a full-time thing. And but along the way, he started studying biblical languages and realized that his study of languages was making him question his religious convictions. And so that was kind of what set him on the path of, first he went to Manchester and then graduated with highest honors from Manchester, and then went on to Oxford, and then again from Oxford into Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So from there, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, Allegro and the rest of the team never really agreed, because at that point Allegro really considered himself agnostic, which is basically not believing in or against any religious doctrine, and of course the rest of the members were Catholics, so he was always at heads with these guys. And the rest of the team, basically what they did was they held on to their allocations of the Dead Sea Scrolls for so long that eventually Allegro and a lot of other researchers around the world started to think that there was a cover-up of the scrolls. And there was, in a way there was, but as Allegro talks about it, it was probably more of a really go slow pace, because I think they really wanted people to forget that the Dead Sea Scrolls were out there. And he found things in the Dead Sea Scrolls such as the teacher of righteousness being hung on a tree being similar to the crucifixion of Jesus, and he just saw a lot of parallels that he felt made the Judeo-Christian story unoriginal. And that's been argued by a lot of other scholars, not just with the Essenes at Qumran, but there's Professor John Rush just last week published a new book called Failed God, in which he argues that not only was Allegro correct in his interpretation of the mushroom in Judeo-Christianity, and not only does he argue that Allegro was correct about Jesus, and this may shock some of your listeners, actually being an anthropomorphism of the sacred mushrooms. And Professor Rush's book was just published on the 28th of October, and it's really the first academic book, and we kind of timed our books to be released about the same time, but his is really the first from a professor to actually come out and say that Allegro's work was correct. And he further goes into show that so many of the similarities in Christianity can be found in ancient Egypt and things like that. And I know that a lot of the people try and attack the research presented in, say, Zeitgeist, for instance. But
sure.
I would recommend your listeners really get into the academic work that's out there and not just focus on other people who haven't also read the academic work, which is most of what flies around out there, is all these people arguing about the research and none of them have read any of it. So I always find that amusing.
I mean, are you going into that battle, so to speak, which it has become by this point? But are you kind of engaged in that at all, or just do you stand up and look at it like a circus, as it is in a way?
Well, it is a circus, and from my perspective, I spent 3 days at Cal State Northridge or University of Northridge, whichever one it is, library, going through all of the academic journals and looking at the research on JSTOR and going through the religious archives that they had there at the university. And I found one reference that was just one guy off on his own arguing against it, but he didn't hit a lot of the points. But I found 15 or 20 references substantiating the work. And so I really suggest to people that are out there, especially attacking Zeitgeist Part 1, to really get out there and get into the universities and check the academic journals and the publications. In fact, Professor Mogdam from Iran, Tehran, Iran, in the 1970s published an article, and this can be found online, showing how Mithra was in fact born of a virgin and how there was actually a form of Jesus in Iran 300 years before the birth of the typical Christ, so which would negate the historical Christ as we think about it. And so there really is a lot of academic work out there if people are willing to look at it. But when they go online and they do Wikipedia searches and they search in online encyclopedias and stuff, they're not going to find it because that's not academic work, and you really need to dive into the academic journals. And after spending 3 days in the library, I pretty much decided at that point that most of the arguments against the work were baseless, that there was just so much substantiation to it in the academic journals that the attacks that are found online seemed fairly absurd.
What we can mention, of course, here, again, for listeners who aren't aware, John Allegro's pivotal work is The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And would you say, after studying some of Allegro's, his life, I guess, basically, or his work primarily, that this is his most important work, if you will?
I would say it is, in fact. I think regardless of what Orthodox academia has to say at this point, I think it really is a huge contribution to religious studies in academia, and it's just hasn't been fully incorporated into theology at this point yet. The further we get away from Allegro's initial impact from the release of his book, the more the dust settles, the more we can see a clear picture of what Allegro was getting at. And really what I found, which I'll get into throughout more of the discussion, is that quite literally all of the attacks against Allegro were fabricated. And I spent 4 years researching all of the entheogenic references specifically in the sacred mushroom and the cross, and found that nearly all of them checked out, which startled me. And because everybody claimed that his research was completely unfounded and that his footnotes were horrible, and I spent years going through and checking all of these things. And as I reveal in my new book, The Holy Mushroom, people are going to have some things to answer to, because what it looks like is that we've had 38 years of academics attacking the work who never bothered to read it, and for that matter, never bothered to actually open up his 150 pages worth of endnotes and verify them. So we've had a handful of scholars in the last 10 years who have actually been doing that, aside from myself. Jack Hare, the author of The Emperor Wears No Clothes, is posed to release his new book on all of this. Professor Carl A.P. Ruck from Boston University is ready to go public that Allegro was correct, and in fact, Ruck endorsed my new book, stating that, in fact, John Allegro's work was for the most part correct. And then I already mentioned Professor John Rush's new book. So right now, we're sort of in the middle of, and in fact, it's just started in the last couple of weeks, really, but we're in the first flood of new information coming out to support Allegro. And I think that in all, if we really wanted to understand the foundations of Judeo-Christianity, instead of just believing that some mystical God-man born by God himself and a virgin floated out of nowhere and rose up to heaven at his death and all of these things, if we use critical thinking and logic in all areas of our life, including religion, if we apply the same basic principles of physics and logic to religion as we do to the rest of life, then suddenly the story has a lot of explaining to do. And
as long as you take it literally, absolutely, yes.
Oh yeah, and in fact, Allegro argued that many of the characters, including Jesus, were never real historical characters, and Professor John Rush also argues that Jesus was never a historical character. I argued in Astrotheology and Shamanism with Andrew Rutaji that Jesus was not a historical character. And in The Holy Mushroom, I have a new image that is also on the front cover of the book that you can see there. If your listeners go to theholymushroom.com, they'll see the front cover of the book there. But that's from a church in France, from Montefrain du Périgord, and that the character on the right side, up in the upper right, is actually Saint Christopher carrying the baby Jesus shaped as a mushroom on his shoulders. So that, and then Professor Rush has also just published evidence last week that from the St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, that the Jesus that's depicted there at the Basilica is in fact showing that is showing Jesus describing himself as a mushroom. But I'll refer your listeners to Rush's